I turned 73 last spring, and I remember thinking that number should feel heavy. It didn't. What felt heavy was the silence on my birthday evening, the dining table I'd set for 8, the roast I'd been tending since noon, the birthday cake my neighbor Margaret had baked and left on the porch that morning with a note that said someone should celebrate you. I read that note 3 times. Then I folded it and put it in my shirt pocket, close to my chest, and I sat down alone and ate. My 3 sons did not come. They didn't even call until the following morning, when their phones suddenly stopped working, and their cars, the ones I'd co-signed for, were gone from their driveways. But I'm getting ahead of myself. My name is Douglas Mercer. I was born in Hamilton, Ontario, raised by a father who fixed boilers and a mother who stretched every dollar like elastic. I learned early that a man's worth isn't measured in what he owns but in what he builds his family, his character, his word. I built a decent life. I spent 31 years running a mid-sized electrical contracting company out of Burlington. Nothing flashy. Enough to pay the mortgage, put 3 boys through university, and still sleep well at night knowing every invoice we sent was honest. My wife, Carol, was the one who kept the whole thing from flying apart. She had this quiet way of holding everything together, me, the boys, the business, the household, without ever making it look like work. She'd sit at the kitchen table on Sunday evenings, going over the family accounts with a cup of tea and a pencil, and I'd walk by, and she'd look up and just smile, like she had everything under control and always had. She probably did. Carol got sick in the winter of 2019. Pancreatic cancer. The doctors told us in February, and she was gone by September. 7 months. In those 7 months, she never once complained about pain. She complained once, exactly once, about the hospital parking fees being unreasonable, and I laughed so hard I cried, and she laughed too, and for about 40 seconds everything was normal again. After she died, I found out what my sons were made of. Our eldest, Nathan, was 44, living in Oakville with his wife and 2 kids. He ran the project management side of my company. I'd handed him that role 6 years before Carol got sick because I trusted him and wanted to start stepping back. During Carol's illness, Nathan came to the hospital 3 times. Not 3 times a week, 3 times total. He was always busy. There was always a deadline, a site visit, a client dinner. I told myself he showed love differently. I told myself that for a long time. He'd gone a different direction, real estate. It did well enough. I'd like to remind people that Travis visited Carol twice in hospital, and both times he spent at least 20 minutes on his phone. After she passed, he called me to ask about the will within the first week. I remember standing in my kitchen, still wearing the same shirt I'd had and hearing him ask what the plan was for the house, the business. I said, "Travis, your mother has been gone 4 days." He said, "I know, Dad. I'm just trying to be practical." Our youngest, Brendan, was 38, in Mississauga. Brendan had always been the one I worried about most, not because he was bad, but because he was easily led. Whatever his brothers thought, Brendan eventually thought. Whatever direction they pointed, he eventually walked. He'd borrowed money from Carol and me 3 times over the years, once for a down payment, once to cover a business that failed, once for reasons he was vague about. Carol kept a small notebook where she tracked these things, not in a vindictive way. Just because she was organized, she tracked everything. After Carol died, things shifted in a way I couldn't quite name at first. My sons still called, still came by occasionally, still behaved like sons in the surface ways. But there was something underneath, an impatience, a kind of waiting. I started to notice it the way you notice a smell in a house that you can't quite locate. Something was off. I just didn't know yet what it was. The answer came, as many things do in this country, through a lawyer. About 4 months after Carol passed, her solicitor, a woman named Patricia Howes, who Carol had dealt with for years, called and asked if I could come in. I assumed it was routine, estate paperwork, title transfer on the house, that kind of thing. I drove to her office in downtown Burlington on a Tuesday morning, and Patricia met me with a handshake and a look on her face that was not quite sympathy and not quite business. It was something in between. She told me that Carol had updated her will and created a separate family trust 6 months before she passed. She'd done this quietly, without telling me, because, and Patricia read this from a letter Carol had written, because I know Douglas will want to discuss it with the boys, and I love him too much to let him talk himself out of what needs to be done. I sat very still in that chair. Patricia slid a sealed envelope across the desk. It was cream-colored, and Carol had written my name on the front in her handwriting. I recognized it immediately, the slightly looped D, the way she always put a little curl on the M. I held it for a moment before I opened it. The letter was 4 pages, handwritten, and I'm not going to share all of it here because some of it belongs only to me. But the part that matters, the part that changed everything, was this. Carol had been watching our sons for years, not suspiciously, just clearly, the way mothers watch. She'd seen the pattern long before I'd let myself see it. She knew about Nathan's coldness, Travis's calculation, Brendan's tendency to follow whatever was most convenient. She'd also been tracking the loans, not just the ones Brendan had taken, but smaller things, a pattern of expectation, a way the boys had of treating our generosity as something they were entitled to, rather than something given in love. She wrote, "I don't blame them entirely. We may have made it too easy for too long. But Douglas, there must be consequences. Not out of cruelty, out of love. Real love, the kind that tells the truth." The trust she had set up was substantial. Carol had always been more financially careful than I realized. She'd been quietly investing for over 20 years, building a portfolio I knew since the 90s, just over $900,000 in managed funds. The conditions of the trust were handled by Patricia entirely. I had no authority to override them or modify them. Carol had structured it that way on purpose. The conditions were simple. Each son would receive his share only if, within the following 2 years, he demonstrated a consistent and genuine relationship with me, defined not by money or obligation, but by presence, communication, and basic human decency. Patricia would assess this based on a set of criteria Carol had outlined, with input from 2 other named individuals whom Carol trusted. If any son failed to meet the conditions, his share would be redirected to a list of charities. Carol had chosen herself a children's hospital in Hamilton, a women's shelter in Burlington, and a literacy foundation she'd volunteered with for years. There was one more condition, and it was the one that brought everything into focus for me. The assessment period would begin on my next birthday, my 73rd, and Carol had written that she hoped by then I would have a clear picture of where each of my sons truly stood. I folded the letter back into the envelope. Patricia gave me a moment. Then she explained that the boys did not know about the trust's specific conditions. They only knew, vaguely, that Carol's estate was in a trust being managed by Patricia's firm, and that it would be distributed in time. They did not know the criteria. They did not know the timeline. And they certainly didn't know that my birthday was the starting line. I drove home and sat in Carol's chair by the window, the one she used to read in, and I thought for a long time. About her, about the boys, about what she'd seen that I'd been too close to see myself. Then I called each of my sons and told them I was planning a birthday dinner, the last Saturday of May, and that I would like them all to come. Nathan said that sounded great, and he'd check with his wife about timing. Travis asked if I was turning 72 or 73, and when I told him, he said, right, and said he'd try to make it work. Brendan said, sure, probably, but his youngest had a hockey tournament that weekend, and he wasn't sure yet. I said, I understand. I'd like all 3 of you there if possible. It matters to me. They all said they'd do their best. 3 weeks before my birthday, I confirmed with each of them. Nathan said he thought they were still coming. Travis had a conflict, now a property showing he'd scheduled for that afternoon, but maybe after. Brendan's son's tournament had been rescheduled, so that wasn't the issue anymore. But now he and his wife had been invited to a friend's cottage opening weekend, and it felt rude to cancel. I said, I understand. I'll have food ready at 6. The evening of my birthday, I set the table. 8 places, my 3 sons, their wives, my 2 grandchildren who lived close enough to come. I made the roast. I had wine. I had the birthday cake Margaret had brought. I had Carol's good dishes out because she always said good dishes shouldn't wait for special occasions, and this was a special occasion. At 5:30, Nathan texted. Something had come up with a subcontractor emergency. He was sorry. He'd call soon. At 5:52, Travis texted. The showing had run long. Clients wanted to see a second property. He hoped I had a good birthday. At 6:15, Brendan called. The cottage was farther than expected. Signal had been bad. He'd been meaning to call all day. He sounded distracted. I could hear music in the background. I said, "Thanks for calling. Enjoy the cottage." He said, "Thanks, Dad. Love you." I said, "I know." I sat at the table with 8 voice sounds. I ate over lunch, and I thought about Carol, and I thought about her letter, and I thought about the word she'd used, presents. Not money, not gifts, not obligation, just showing up. That was all she'd asked me. That was all I'd asked. I didn't cry. I want to be honest about that, not because I'm a tough man, but because I wasn't surprised. I think somewhere I'd been working very hard not to look. I had known this was coming. Carol had known. She'd known before I'd let myself know. I washed the dishes. I wrapped the untouched portions in foil. I went to bed. I did not call my sons back that night. The next morning, Patricia Howes called me before I'd finished my coffee. She told me, calmly and professionally, that in her assessment and in the assessment of the two individuals Carol had named the birthday dinner, had provided the final data point she'd needed. She said she was sorry. She said she would be proceeding with the trust according to Carol's instructions. I asked what that meant practically. She explained. The co-signed vehicles, 2 of the 3 boys, had vehicles I was still technically co-signed on due to arrangements made years ago, would be returned to the relevant financing companies, with the outstanding balances covered by the trust as part of an estate settlement, but the vehicles themselves repossessed per the default clauses Patricia had quietly inserted, with my cooperation, 3 months prior. The rental property in Ancaster, which Travis had been informally managing and from which he'd been taking a management fee, had been formally transferred out of informal arrangement and listed for sale that same week, something I'd authorized in writing 2 weeks earlier. Nathan's role in the company, which I had begun formally restructuring with the help of a business lawyer in March, had been officially transitioned, with the company itself listed for acquisition by a competitor I'd been in quiet discussions with since February. I had spent 5 months cooperating with Patricia and Carol's plan without fully understanding, until that morning, that I was executing it. By mid-morning, I had 41 missed calls. Nathan called 8 times before noon. When I finally answered, he was not sad. He was furious. He said I had blindsided him. He said the company was his future, that he'd given years to it, that I'd always told him it would be his. I said, "Nathan, I told you it could be yours. That was always conditional on being someone who deserved it." There was a long silence. Then he said something I won't repeat, and hung up. Travis called 4 times in the afternoon. His tone was different, not furious, calculating. He asked if there was a way to discuss the rental property situation, whether there was still a window, whether I'd be open to mediation. I listened to all of it. Then I said, "Travis, when your mother was in the hospital, how many times did you visit?" He didn't answer. I said, "I'm not asking to hurt you. I'm asking because I want you to sit with that number for a while." Then I said goodbye. Brendan called that evening. He was crying, which surprised me not because Brendan isn't emotional, but because I wasn't sure, until I heard him, whether the tears were real or performed. I still don't know completely, but I let him talk. He said he knew he'd been selfish. He said he'd told himself he was giving me space to grieve, that he hadn't wanted to intrude, that he'd convinced himself I was fine. I said, "Brendan, your mother died. Your father turned 73 alone. Those are not things a person needs space from. Those are things a person needs his sons for." He cried harder. I told him I loved him. I also told him that love without action is just a feeling. And a feeling doesn't set a table. In the weeks that followed, my house was quieter than it had ever been. I won't pretend it was easy. There were mornings I stood in the kitchen and missed Carol so acutely it was almost physical. Missed her, and also felt a complicated grief for the sons I thought I had. The family I believed was there. You build a picture of your life over decades, and when pieces of it reveal themselves to be different, there's a mourning in that, even when you understand why it happened. But there was also, underneath that grief, something I hadn't expected. Clarity. A kind of clean air that comes when you stop pretending. Margaret came over for tea most Wednesdays. My brother in Guelph called more after I told him what had happened. I joined a woodworking group at the community center, something I'd been putting off for years because I always thought I should be working, and found, to my genuine surprise, that I was good at it and that I liked the people there. A man named Albert, who was 78, and had the hands words of someone who built half the furniture in his house. He told me once that the hardest skill in woodworking is learning when to stop sanding. You could ruin a piece by trying to make it perfect. Sometimes you have to accept that the great is working and let it be that it's not true. I thought about my son when he said that. Brendan called again in July, and then in August. Not about learning, just to talk. I won't say we've repaired everything, because I don't think repair is the right word. You can't repair something back to what it was. If what it was had cracks, you couldn't see it. But we are building something new, slowly. In the honest way you build things, you stop pretending the foundation is solid. He came to Burlington in September and we had dinner together, just the two of us. And he didn't ask about the trust, and I didn't bring it up. And we talked about his kids and his work, and a documentary he'd watched about the highway infrastructure in Northern Ontario, and it was the best conversation we'd had in years because there was nothing underneath it except two people who were trying. Nathan did not call. Travis called once, in October, and it became clear within 5 minutes that he'd spoken to a lawyer. I wished him well and ended the call. The trust proceeded according to Carol's instructions. I knew, because Patricia kept me informed with minimal detail, that the charitable distributions were made in the year. The Children's Hospital in Hamilton received a significant donation in Carol's name. So did the Women's Shelter. So did the Literacy Foundation. I attended a small acknowledgement event at the hospital in November. They'd named a room in a new wing after her. I stood in that hallway and looked at her name on the wall and thought about the woman who had sat at a kitchen table with a pencil and a cup of tea, quietly building something none of us had known she was building. She built accountability into the blueprint of our family. She just had to wait until she was gone to use it. I turned 74 this past spring. Margaret made the cake again. My brother drove in from Guelph. Albert from the woodworking group came with his wife. Brendan came with his 2 kids, who are 8 and 11, and who spent most of the afternoon trying to teach me a card game I'll never fully understand and didn't want to stop playing. The table was full. Not with the people I'd expected to fill it. With the people who chose to. There is a difference. It took me a long time to understand that distinction, to feel it rather than just know it in my head. You cannot manufacture the presence of someone who doesn't want to be present. You cannot make yourself matter to people who have decided you don't. What you can do, what Carol understood long before I did, is stop absorbing the cost of that absence as though it were your failure. She left me one last line at the bottom of that 4-page letter. Below everything else, below all the practical instructions and the careful words, in smaller handwriting than the rest, she'd written, "Don't be lonely, Douglas. You were always better at being loved than you believed." I kept that line in my shirt pocket for months. I think it's still in the jacket I wore the first day of woodworking class. I should find it. Some things deserve to be kept somewhere better than a pocket. But maybe she also meant that some things don't need to be stored at all. Some things, once you've read them enough times, just become part of how you see. Not every family looks the way you drew it when you were young. Not every son becomes the person you hoped for. Not every relationship survives honesty, but the ones that do are worth more than all the ones held together by silence and money, and the pretending that everything is fine when it isn't. Carol used to say the truest things in the quietest voice. She'd say them once, and then she'd move on. And you either caught it or you didn't. I caught most of them. I just wish I'd been listening sooner. If your children call only when they need something, it is not a reflection of your worth. It is a reflection of what they were allowed to learn. If you have spent decades giving without condition, you may have accidentally taught the people you love most that your presence has no conditions either. Love without expectation is a virtue. Love without benefits is a permanent waiting to happen. The most loving thing a parent can do is not always to give. Sometimes it is to stop, to be still, to let the absence of your yes become its own kind of answer. And if it is too late for the lessons to land with the people who gave them to you, give them anyway to the walls, to the air, to the stranger, watching this on a screen in a city you'll never visit. Someone is listening. Carol always believed that. So do I.